Presidential approval ratings have been around since the mid-1940s. I'm not particularly interested in you memorizing any of this. I just thought you might find it very interesting. It gives you a historic look at presidential approval ratings. Now, historically, you can take an overall average. Harry Truman, for example, had a 45.4%, Dwight Eisenhower 65. You can look at it. The president who overall had the highest average approval was George H.W. Bush. And he and John Kennedy both came in at very high rating, 60 to 70%. But notice a trend. With Harry Truman, he started out, of course, this was the effect. He followed FDR. Very few people knew who he was. His approval ratings through end of the war began to drop. And then after and peaked back up to where he came up to almost 47% for the 48 to 49% for the election of 1948, peaked in 1949 back at 70%, and then kind of did a slow decline. Eisenhower is probably the greatest exception of all these that you're going to look at. Notice that his approval ratings remained relatively constant. John F. Kennedy, although there was some decline, never dropped below 60%. Lyndon Johnson, again, took over after an assassinated president, and his ratings began to decline. And when he left the presidency, he was a little bit over 50% approval rating. President Ford. Fascinatingly enough, Ford's approval ratings began to go up. He was only president for a little over a year and a half. Jimmy Carter's up and down. Same pattern here, though. Initially very high, declining, maybe some spiking back up. Ronald Reagan, like Eisenhower, remained relatively popular. Now, the fascinating thing about Reagan is he remained personally popular, although many of his policies and programs did not. George H.W. Bush started out at barely 50%, got up to one point of almost 90% approval, then began a slow decline, peaked back up toward the end of his administration. Clinton is probably one of the most interesting exceptions to the rules. The more he was attacked, the more he was criticized, the better his approval rating became. George H.W. Bush started out, you can see the effect of 9/11, jumped up to over 90% approval, and then began a slow decline. Ended his presidency at slightly over 30% approval rating. Obama, it's sort of interesting. His approval ratings and disapproval ratings, the bottom line is the disapproval rating. Obama started doing this. This is a slightly different polling company. This is not Gallup. This is Huffington Post pollster, and it's basically on either side of 50% either way. Right now, when this poll was taken, he was disapproved by 49.5, 46. Now, I want to conclude this very short little lecture by pointing out that the approval ratings that a president has at the end of his presidency tend to be very different than the approval ratings if you end up 5 or 10 years later. Truman is now considered by presidential scholars one of the best, although at the time he was president that was not the case. Obama's approval rating among experts among those who study the presidency, has really improved. So what will it look like in 10 years? Your guess is as